Page 124. As Grandma said, we got off easy. The tornado had dealt us a glancing blow. It set down on farmland between here and Oakley, plowing a giant furrow and annihilating a corn crib. But it was all people talked about, so the end of school crept up before we knew it. I noticed a change in Grandma. Sometimes I couldn't tell whether she was changing or I was, but this time she was. Though never idle, she was a whirling dervish now. She undertook a second bout of spring cleaning, even after she'd rubbed all the finish off the house the first time around. Now that Mr. Arnold Green had gone back to New York to await Miss Butler, Grandma turned his mattress and painted all the trim in his room. I came home one afternoon to find half the contents of the Cobb house out in the yard. I thought the tornado had come back. Grandma was inside with her hair tied up, giving the Cobb house the cleaning of its life. She could never throw anything away, but a used flypaper strip, so she was rearranging. In the yard stood a turning lathe, a shingle machine, a circular saw, a row of chamber pots from the days when they were decorated with moss roses. Bootsy and April sat up on the back porch, waiting for this to be over. When I offered to give Grandma a hand, she snapped my head off. "Go up in that house and study for them exams," she barked, though we both knew no power on earth could save me in math. But she wouldn't even let me set the table for supper these nights. I took my sweet time figuring out what had come over Grandma. Then graduation came, with ceremonies in the United Brethren Church. All the town but Grandma was there. After the experience of the Christmas program, Miss Butler decided against pulling a choir together. As president of the Board of Education, Mr. Earl T. Askew handed out the 5 diplomas, and Royce McNabb was valedictorian. He'd won a tuition scholarship to the U of I at Champaign. The all-school party was that night, a hayride and a weenie roast out at the Bowman farm. There weren't enough boys for a prom, and the Baptists and the Methodists didn't dance. We could fit the whole school on a hay frame, pulled by 2 mules. Some of us were too shy for a party. The Johnson brothers didn't show up. Then that evening turned out to be a greater disaster than the tornado, if you were Carlene Lovejoy. On the hayride home, Royce and I sat together on the hay frame, backed by the lantern dangling our feet. I don't know how it happened. Call it fate. "How's things at your house?" Roy hazarded, though he still wasn't much for small talk. "Oh, don't rub it in," I said. "No, I think your grandma's a real interesting person," he said, and our hands brushed. "Everybody, Royce, we're lucky she's not here on this hay frame with us. You must have noticed she rarely misses a party. But let's leave her out of this if we can. The moon's out and Carlene's in a snit because we're sitting together. Let's just enjoy ourselves and have a hayride." "Are you bossy?" he inquired, a lantern light woven into his knitted brows. "Who, me?" I said. "Maybe a little." "What would happen if I wrote to you from the U of I?" "I'd faint and fall over from surprise," I said, though somehow his arm had found its way around my shoulder. "There are a lot of girls at the U of I. It's a coeducational institution." "But what would you do if I did?" he said. "Write, I mean." "I'd write back," I said, and Ina Ray buried in the hay behind us, but near enough I could feel her breath on my ear, told Carlene all about it. When I came in that night with straw in my hair, I knew it was time for a showdown with Grandma. She was in the front room pretending to be asleep in the platform rocker. As a rule, she had to wake herself up to go to bed. But she was sitting up for me, awake behind her eyelids. "What?" she said, sitting when I stepped up beside her. "Grandma, I've been thinking." "You should have tried that in math class," she observed. "Grandma, I don't want to go back to Chicago. I want to stay here with you." She knew, of course. Dad was working now. They'd found an apartment up in Rogers Park. Mother was fixing up the second bedroom for me. They wanted me home as soon as school was out. They wanted me. I wanted to explain to Grandma how she needed me here. I'd fuss about her if I wasn't here to see how she was. But she'd spent days working herself into the ground to prove I was only in her way. She'd been helping me leave for a week. I need your bed, she said. I'm thinking about running this place as a rooming house. I missed the rent off that little New York feller. Grandma, might cook for them and bring in a little extra that way. She was looking aside, out the bay window into the dark. Grandma, was I too much trouble? Now that went too far. But I was her granddaughter, and she taught me everything I knew, and I liked to win. Her hand came up to her mouth, that big old work-scarred hand with Grandpa Dowdle's gold band embedded in it. What would your pa think if I kept you? She said finally. I don't want your ma after me. Grandma, Mother's terrified of you. She always was. You know that. Me? Grandma was a picture of surprise. She's from Chicago. I'm nothing but an old country gal. She could look at me again now through her eyes were pink and glistening. You take that kitten. I'll keep the cat, she said, and you go home to your folks. It'll be all right. I don't lock my doors. That meant I could come back whenever I could manage it. And she was telling me to go. She knew the decision was too big a load for me to carry by myself. She knew me through and through. She had highs in the back of her heart. Page 129. This is the last chapter, and it's a short one. It's called Ever After. I was married in Grandma's house, in the front room. It was a sunny day and warm weather. She'd taken down the stove, and the windows of the bay stood open over the bobbing snowball bushes. It was in the last year of the war, and you can't imagine how things were then. The war scattered people to the four winds. Joey was flying B-17 Fortress missions over Germany, and so my heart lived in my mouth. Dad was doing war work with Boeing out in Seattle. He and Mother were living there. Travel was next to impossible, so they couldn't be there. Even the bridegroom's family couldn't come to the wedding. It would have been easier to get married in Chicago. I'd held on to the apartment in Rogers Park and took the L every morning down to the Tribune Tower to my cub reporter job. Those newsy notes had paid off in time, though it meant I'd have to ride the wartime version of the Wabash Bluebird sitting on my luggage in the aisle. I wanted to be married in Grandma's house. I'd saved up my ration card for new shoes and a suit from the basement store at Marshall Field. Though I wore a hat and gloves, I was married bare-legged because you couldn't buy nylons by then for love or money. Then it was an all last-minute rush because I had to marry my soldier on a 3-day pass. Grandma baked the wedding cake. Sugar was hard to come by, though not for her. She made me a nosegay bouquet to carry, lilies of the valley and Queen Anne's lace from her yard, poked through a paper doily. She wore her floral print with the neck collar, the dress she'd worn years ago to the county fair. Reverend Lutz of the United Brethren Church stood by the platform rocker to perform the ceremony. When he asked who gave the bride away in marriage, Grandma said, "That'd be me." She handed me over, and then she looked aside out the bay window, blinking at the brightness of the day. I know because I looked back for one more glimpse of her. Then I married Royce McNabb, and we lived happily ever after.